June 22, 1944. 3 years to the day since Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Dawn breaks over the forests of Belarus, painting the birch trees in pale gold. Inside a reinforced command bunker near Vitebsk, Colonel Hans-Georg Leyser of the 299th Infantry Division studies his morning reports. The coffee has gone cold. Outside, morning mist clings to the marshlands. Everything seems quiet. Too quiet. Leyser doesn't know it yet, but in 2 hours 2.4 million Soviet soldiers will begin the complete annihilation of Army Group Center. Within 5 weeks, 28 German divisions will cease to exist. More German soldiers will be lost than at Stalingrad. The Wehrmacht's spine in the east will be shattered beyond repair. This is the morning Operation Bagration begins. This is the morning everything changes. The Eastern Front in June 1944 stretched across 2,000 kilometers of blood-soaked earth. 3 years of war had transformed the landscape into a scarred testament to human destruction. Cities lay in ruins. Villages had been erased. Millions were dead. And still the war ground on. Army Group Center held the critical center of this line. Under Field Marshal Ernst Busch, it defended Belarus and the direct route to East Prussia and Poland. 4 armies comprised this force: 3rd Panzer, 4th, 9th and 2nd Armies. On paper it looked formidable. 38 divisions. Nearly 850,000 men. Over 500 tanks and assault guns. 9,000 artillery pieces. But paper strength meant nothing in modern war. These divisions were shadows of their former selves. The 78th Sturm Division, which had entered Russia with 17,000 men, now fielded barely 8,000. Panzer units operated at half strength. Artillery batteries made do with captured Soviet guns when German ammunition ran low. Veterans who had survived since 1941 were increasingly rare. Their replacements were older men, boys, and Volksdeutsch conscripts from occupied territories who barely spoke German. The defensive positions looked impressive on situation maps. The Fatherland Line ran along the Dnieper. Fortified cities, Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk, were designated as Festerplatze, fortified places to be held at all costs. Hitler had personally ordered these cities to be transformed into fortresses that would break any Soviet offensive like rocks breaking waves. Colonel Leyser knew better. His sector near Vitebsk demonstrated the reality. The fortifications existed mainly in reports sent to Berlin. Concrete was scarce. Steel even scarcer. Instead of reinforced bunkers, his men dug earthworks. Instead of integrated defensive zones, they held isolated strongpoints connected by patrol routes through the forest. The swamps that were supposed to protect their flanks also prevented rapid reinforcement or retreat. The strategic situation had shifted dramatically since winter. The Wehrmacht had suffered catastrophic defeats in Ukraine. Army groups south and north Ukraine had been mauled. 17 divisions were destroyed at Korsun-Cherkasy. The Crimea was lost. Soviet forces had reached the Romanian border. In the north, the siege of Leningrad had been broken. The Red Army was advancing everywhere except in the center. This apparent stability in Belarus bred dangerous complacency. German intelligence believed the Soviets would continue pushing in Ukraine toward the Romanian oil fields. Or perhaps strike Army Group North to knock Finland out of the war. Belarus, with its swamps and forests, seemed an unlikely target for major operations. The spring Rasputitsa, the muddy season, had only recently ended. Surely the Soviets would need time to reorganize after their winter offensives. Field Marshal Busch shared this assessment. He had requested permission to create elastic defense lines, to pull back from exposed positions, to create mobile reserves. Hitler refused. Not 1 meter of ground was to be surrendered voluntarily. The fortified cities would hold. The enemy would bleed themselves white against German positions. It was the same strategy that had failed at Stalingrad, at Kursk in Ukraine. But Hitler's word was final. While German commanders studied their maps in concrete bunkers, the forests of Belarus concealed the largest concentration of military power ever assembled on the Eastern Front. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's 1st Belarusian Front. Marshal Ivan Bagramian's 1st Baltic Front. General Ivan Cherniakovsky's 3rd Belarusian Front. Marshal Georgy Zhukov coordinated the entire operation. Names that would echo through military history. The numbers defied comprehension. 2.4 million soldiers. 5,200 tanks and self-propelled guns. 5,300 aircraft. 31,000 artillery pieces and mortars. The Red Army had learned from 3 years of bitter fighting. This was not the poorly coordinated force of 1941. These were veterans of Stalingrad, Kursk, and the liberation of Ukraine. They knew how to break German defenses. But numbers alone wouldn't guarantee victory. The Soviets had achieved something perhaps more impressive: complete strategic surprise. Operation Bagration, named after the Georgian prince who had fought Napoleon, was hidden behind one of the most successful deception campaigns in military history. Maskirovka, the Russian art of military deception, reached its apotheosis in June 1944. In Ukraine, Soviet forces ostentatiously prepared for continued offensives. Radio traffic increased. Tanks moved openly during daylight. Reconnaissance flights multiplied. German intelligence dutifully noted every detail, confirming their preconceptions. Meanwhile, in the Belarus forests, entire armies moved only at night. Tanks were hidden under camouflage nets. Radio silence was absolute. Aircraft were grounded to avoid detection. The partisans played a crucial role. Behind German lines, 143,000 Soviet partisans controlled vast areas of Belarus. They reported every German movement, every supply train, every reinforcement. German troops barely controlled the main roads and cities. The forests belonged to the partisans. On the night of June 19 to 20th, they struck. Operation Rail War destroyed over 10,000 rail cuts in a single night. German logistics, already strained, began to collapse before the offensive even began. Soviet commanders had studied their enemy carefully. They knew German doctrine emphasized holding strong points while counterattacking with mobile reserves. So they planned to bypass strong points, encircle them, and destroy German reserves before they could react. Multiple breakthrough sectors would prevent the Germans from concentrating their response. Overwhelming artillery would pulverize defenses. Tank armies would exploit breakthroughs immediately, driving deep into German rear areas. The renamed fronts themselves were part of the deception. German intelligence knew the Third Belarusian Front had been heavily engaged in earlier fighting. They assumed it needed rest and reinforcement. They didn't know it had been secretly rebuilt to full strength. They tracked the 6th Guards Army in the Baltic region. They didn't know it had been replaced by dummy units while the Real Army moved south. Colonel Leyser's morning reports reflected this intelligence failure. Partisan activity was increasing, yes, but that was normal for summer. Soviet reconnaissance patrols were probing, but nothing unusual. Artillery fire had actually decreased in recent days. His sector showed 11 Soviet rifle divisions opposite his lines. The actual number was 32, with more arriving hourly. At Stavka headquarters in Moscow, Stalin personally approved the final plans. The offensive would begin on June 22, 3 years to the day after Barbarossa. The symbolism was intentional. The Red Army would show the world how much it had learned, how much it had grown, how thoroughly it could destroy those who had brought such suffering to the Soviet Union. The German Army Group Center controlled the shortest route to Berlin. That route would be blown wide open. From Field Marshal Busch's headquarters in Minsk, the situation appeared manageable. His staff officers, products of the Prussian military tradition, maintained their efficient routine. Morning reports were compiled. Supply requests were processed. Orders were distributed with typical German precision. But precision meant nothing when based on false assumptions. Busch commanded from a fundamental disadvantage. Hitler's no-retreat orders had stripped him of tactical flexibility. When Soviet forces had previously attacked at Vitebsk in winter, Busch had wanted to withdraw to better positions. Hitler refused. Now the 3rd Panzer Army sat in a dangerous salient, exposed on 3 sides. The same situation existed at Bobruisk, where 9th Army projected into Soviet lines like a target waiting to be surrounded. The command structure itself was compromised. Hitler trusted no one fully after the July 20th plot, which hadn't happened yet but whose conspirators were already active. Orders came directly from Wolf's lair, often bypassing theater commanders. Divisions couldn't retreat without Hitler's personal permission. This permission had to be requested through channels, considered, and approved. In modern mechanized warfare, where hours mattered, German units needed days to make basic tactical decisions. Colonel Leyser experienced this paralysis firsthand. His 299th Infantry Division held a 45-kilometer front, 3 times the doctrinal maximum. He had identified several vulnerable sectors where Soviet buildup was obvious. His requests for reinforcement were denied. His suggestion to create secondary defensive lines was rejected as defeatist thinking. He was told to hold his current positions with current forces. Make do with what you have. The eternal refrain of doomed armies. German intelligence had once been legendary. In 1941, they had identified virtually every Soviet division. By 1944 they were effectively blind. The Abwehr had been compromised by British intelligence. The Luftwaffe lacked aircraft for reconnaissance. Ground reconnaissance was limited to immediate tactical depths. And perhaps most crucially, German racial ideology prevented them from believing Slavic peoples capable of sophisticated deception. Major Reinhard Gellen's Foreign Armies East estimated Soviet strength in Belarus at roughly 140 rifle divisions and 11 tank corps. The actual numbers were 168 rifle divisions and 12 tank and mechanized corps, with more in reserve. They identified 400,000 Soviet soldiers facing Army Group Center. The real number exceeded 1 million in the first echelon alone. The intelligence failure went beyond numbers. German doctrine assumed Soviet offensives would follow predictable patterns. Massive artillery preparation, infantry assault, tank exploitation. They didn't anticipate the sophisticated combined arms tactics the Red Army had developed. They didn't expect infiltration units to bypass strongpoints entirely. They didn't foresee Soviet commanders willingly accepting casualties to maintain momentum. The Red Army of 1944 was not the Red Army of 1941, but German thinking hadn't evolved. At the battalion and company level, German soldiers sensed what their generals missed. Sergeant Otto Feldman, serving in the 267th Infantry Division near Orsha, wrote to his wife on June 20, "The Ivans are too quiet. When they're quiet, they're planning something." Soldiers noticed Soviet patrol patterns had changed. Artillery observers reported new gun positions masked by false battery locations. Infantry outposts heard engines at night, many engines carefully muffled. The German defensive system, impressive on paper, had fatal weaknesses. The main line of resistance was actually a series of strongpoints rather than a continuous line. These strongpoints, usually a reinforced company, were supposed to support each other with interlocking fields of fire. But in the forests and swamps of Belarus, visibility was often less than 100 meters. Strongpoints couldn't see each other, much less provide mutual support. Anti-tank defenses were particularly weak. The new Soviet IS-2 heavy tanks and Su-152 assault guns could destroy German positions from outside effective return fire range. German commanders had requested more 88mm guns, the only weapon truly effective against Soviet heavy armor. They received a handful. Most anti-tank defense relied on Panzerfausts, single-shot weapons effective only at suicidal ranges. Logistics compounded every problem. A German infantry division required 300 tons of supplies daily to maintain combat effectiveness. With partisan attacks on rail lines, most divisions received less than half their requirements. Artillery units rationed shells. Medical units lacked morphine. Food supplies were so short that soldiers foraged in abandoned villages, competing with civilians for scraps. Behind the statistics and strategic analyses were human beings. Young men who had been drafted into a war they increasingly knew was lost. By June 1944, the average German soldier on the Eastern Front had been fighting for 2 years. He had seen friends die horribly. He had participated in or witnessed atrocities. He knew what would happen if the Soviets broke through. Letters home, carefully censored, still revealed the psychological strain. Private Heinrich Müller wrote, "We hold our positions and do our duty. What else can we do? The alternative is unthinkable." The alternative was Soviet captivity, which German propaganda portrayed as certain death. This fear kept exhausted men fighting long after hope was gone. But fear alone couldn't maintain effectiveness. Units showed signs of combat fatigue that German military culture refused to acknowledge. Shell shock was considered cowardice. Soldiers who broke were shot. So men endured, self-medicating with alcohol when available, gradually losing the initiative and aggressiveness that had once characterized German tactical superiority. Soviet soldiers faced their own fears. Many had personal scores to settle. Sergeant Ivan Petrov of the 5th Guards Tank Army had lost his entire family when Germans occupied his village in 1941. For him and millions like him, this offensive was more than strategic necessity. It was revenge. It was justice. It was the beginning of the end for those who had brought such suffering to their homeland. This emotional fuel would drive them through German defenses with an intensity that surprised even Soviet commanders. June 22, 1944. 5 a.m. The morning mist had barely lifted when the forests of Belarus erupted. Not with the traditional hours-long artillery barrage German doctrine expected, but with something more terrifying: precision. Soviet reconnaissance units had spent weeks identifying every German command post, every artillery position, every supply dump. Now 31,000 guns fired simultaneously with mapped coordinates. Colonel Leyser's command bunker shook. Concrete dust filled the air. The field telephone went dead, a direct hit on the communications node. Within minutes, his carefully maintained command structure collapsed. He couldn't contact his battalions. His battalions couldn't contact their companies. Each strong point was isolated, fighting alone. The artillery preparation lasted exactly 120 minutes in most sectors. Short by Eastern Front standards, but devastating in its concentration. Soviet gunners fired 170,000 shells in the opening bombardment. Entire German companies ceased to exist. The 78th Sturm Division's 2nd Battalion simply vanished. 500 men erased in minutes. When forward observers finally reported, they described moonscapes where forests had stood. Then came the assault groups. Not the human waves of German propaganda, but specially trained storm units. Combat engineers with flamethrowers and explosive charges. Submachine gunners trained in close combat. Tank rider infantry who had learned to coordinate with armor. They flowed through German lines like water through a broken dam, bypassing strong points, surrounding them, leaving them for follow-up forces. At Vitebsk, General George Hans Reinhardt's 3rd Panzer Army faced the full weight of Bagramian's 1st Baltic and Cherniakovsky's 3rd Belarusian fronts. The city Hitler had declared a fortress was attacked from 3 directions simultaneously. The LII Corps, holding the northern sector, reported Soviet tanks in their rear areas by noon. How had they gotten there? The front line was supposedly holding. The answer revealed the sophistication of Soviet planning. Engineer units had built corduroy roads through swamps Germans considered impassable. Tanks fitted with logs and fascines crossed terrain German commanders hadn't bothered to defend. By evening, the 6th Guards Army had advanced 15 kilometers. The German defensive system hadn't been broken, it had been made irrelevant. South of Vitebsk, the situation deteriorated hourly. The 299th Infantry Division, Colonel Leyser's command, faced the 5th Guards Rifle Corps. Soviet infiltration units had penetrated during the night, lying hidden until the bombardment began. When German survivors emerged from bunkers, they found Soviet soldiers already behind them. Panic spread. Trained soldiers became fugitives. Field Marshal Busch finally recognized the scale of the assault. This was not a local attack but a front-wide offensive. He requested permission to withdraw the exposed units at Vitebsk. Hitler refused. The fortress must hold. Busch ordered his only operational reserve, the 20th Panzer Division, to counterattack. They ran into the 5th Guards Tank Army and were destroyed in detail. By nightfall, German forces had lost 25,000 casualties and hadn't even slowed the Soviet advance. June 23 dawned with German forces in chaos. The fortress cities Hitler had insisted on holding were becoming death traps. At Vitebsk, 5 German divisions were being systematically surrounded. General Reinhardt pleaded for permission to withdraw. Hitler's response: Vitebsk will be held to the last man. The Soviet breakthrough expanded exponentially. When German strongpoints were bypassed, they couldn't interdict Soviet supply lines as doctrine intended. Soviet forces had developed sophisticated traffic control, routing follow-up forces around German positions like water around rocks. The isolated strongpoints, running out of ammunition and hope, could only radio increasingly desperate situation reports. Colonel Leyser's division exemplified the unfolding catastrophe. Cut off from adjacent units, his strongpoints were being reduced one by one. Soviet assault groups used a methodical approach: surround, bombard, assault. German soldiers fought with desperate courage, but courage couldn't overcome mathematical reality. Each strongpoint that fell freed Soviet forces to concentrate on the next. By June 25, the 299th Infantry Division had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. The psychological collapse preceded the physical one. German soldiers had been told they were holding the Soviets. Now Soviet tank armies were racing past them toward Minsk. They had been told German armor would counterattack. Now burning Tigers and Panthers littered the roads. They had been told the Luftwaffe would provide support. The sky belonged entirely to Soviet aircraft. On June 25, Hitler finally authorized withdrawal from Vitebsk. Too late. The city was surrounded. 5 divisions, 35,000 men, were trapped. General Friedrich Gallwitzer, commanding the encircled forces, received Hitler's personal order: break out with 1 division, leave the rest to hold the fortress. It was militarily insane. Gallwitzer obeyed. The breakout attempt on June 26 turned into slaughter. The 4th Luftwaffe Field Division, leading the escape, walked into prepared Soviet positions. Machine guns firing from three sides turned forest paths into killing fields. Of 8,000 men who attempted the breakout, fewer than 200 reached German lines. Gallwitzer himself was captured. The remaining forces in Vitebsk surrendered on June 27. The same pattern repeated across the entire front. Orsha fell on June 26. Mogilev on June 28. Bobruisk, where Hitler had concentrated 70,000 troops, was surrounded by June 27. The Ninth Army, trying to withdraw, was caught in the open by Soviet aircraft. The Minsk-Moscow highway became known as the Highway of Death, 40 kilometers of destroyed vehicles and dead horses. Field Marshal Busch was relieved of command on June 28, replaced by Field Marshal Walter Model, the Führer's fireman. But even Model couldn't extinguish this inferno. By the time he assumed command, Army Group Center had functionally ceased to exist. 3 armies had been shattered. 28 divisions had been destroyed. The Soviet spearheads were approaching Minsk, the communications hub for the entire Central Front. If Minsk fell, nothing could stop the Red Army from reaching Poland. The complete collapse of German positions in the east, unthinkable just a week earlier, was now inevitable. By July 3, 1944, when Soviet forces liberated Minsk, the statistics of destruction defied comprehension. Army Group Center had lost 300,000 men in 2 weeks. 28 divisions had been completely destroyed. Another 16 were reduced to battalion strength. The 4th Army had ceased to exist. The 3rd Panzer Army retained only its name, it had no tanks left. The 9th Army was a collection of stragglers trying to reach German lines. The material losses were equally catastrophic. The Wehrmacht lost 215 tanks and assault guns, nearly half its armor strength on the Eastern Front. 1,500 artillery pieces were destroyed or captured. 57,000 vehicles were lost. The Luftwaffe lost 300 aircraft trying to support doomed ground forces. 20 generals were killed or captured. The German military machine that had conquered Europe was being ground to scrap metal in the forests of Belarus. Soviet forces liberated concentration camps and discovered mass graves. In every liberated town, civilians emerged with stories of German occupation. Minsk alone had lost 400,000 civilians. Villages had been burned with inhabitants inside. The liberating soldiers saw firsthand what they were fighting against. It hardened their resolve for the campaigns ahead. The human wreckage was most visible in the prisoner columns. On July 17, Moscow staged Operation Grand Waltz, a parade of 57,000 German prisoners through the streets. Led by 19 generals, they marched in silence while millions of Soviets watched. These were not the supermen of Nazi propaganda but exhausted, defeated humans. Street cleaners followed the column, symbolically washing away the filth of fascism. The message was clear, the Wehrmacht was broken. 4 German soldiers who escaped encirclement, the retreat became an endurance test. Private Kurt Wagner, one of the few survivors from the 267th Infantry Division, later described the journey. "We walked at night, hid during the day. Partisans hunted us. Our own people shot suspected deserters. Soviet aircraft attacked anything that moved. Of my company of 120 men, 7 reached German lines. The speed of collapse prevented organized evacuation of wounded. Field hospitals were overrun with patients still on operating tables. Medical personnel faced an impossible choice: abandon the wounded or become prisoners. Most chose captivity. Soviet forces captured over 1,500 doctors and 3,000 medical orderlies. 4 wounded German soldiers. Capture often meant death, not from execution but from the impossibility of treating tens of thousands of casualties. The strategic consequences of Bagration rippled across every front. With Army Group Center destroyed, the entire German position in the east unraveled. Army Group North was isolated in the Baltic states, eventually trapped in the Kurland pocket. Army Group North Ukraine's flank was exposed, forcing withdrawal from western Ukraine. The Wehrmacht had to transfer divisions from France, weakening the Normandy defenses just as Allied forces broke out from their beachheads. Field Marshal Model, surveying the wreckage he had inherited, reported to Hitler that rebuilding Army Group Center would require 30 fresh divisions. Germany didn't have 30 divisions to spare. Every theater was screaming for reinforcements. The strategic reserve was exhausted. Boys and old men were being drafted. The Volkssturm, the People's Militia, was being organized. These were not signs of strength but admissions of defeat. Hitler's response revealed his increasing detachment from reality. He blamed the generals for cowardice. He instituted new regulations making family members liable for soldiers' failures. He ordered investigations into why fortress cities had fallen. He never acknowledged that his rigid defensive strategy had caused the catastrophe. Even after Bagration, he insisted on holding untenable positions, guaranteeing future encirclements. Colonel Leyser, who had survived the destruction of his division, was reassigned to a reconstituted unit filled with teenagers and walking wounded. In his private papers discovered after the war he wrote, "We are no longer fighting to win. We are fighting to delay the inevitable. Every day we hold is another day for civilians to flee west. That is our only remaining purpose." The psychological impact on German forces cannot be overstated. The Wehrmacht had maintained morale through 3 years of retreats by believing they were conducting tactical withdrawals, trading space for enemy casualties. Bagration shattered this fiction. This was not tactical withdrawal but complete rout. Units that had maintained cohesion since 1941 simply dissolved. The bonds of discipline that had held the German army together were breaking. Soviet commanders, studying the results, were themselves surprised by the completeness of victory. Marshal Rokossovsky later wrote, "We expected success but not collapse on this scale. Entire German armies simply ceased to exist. We advanced so rapidly that our supply lines couldn't keep pace. We had to halt not because of German resistance but because our tanks ran out of fuel." By the end of July, Soviet forces had advanced 450 kilometers. They stood on the Vistula River looking at Warsaw. They had reached the borders of East Prussia, German soil. The Red Army that Hitler had dismissed as subhuman was preparing to invade the Reich itself. The road to Berlin, blocked for 3 years, was now open. The destruction of Army Group Center had changed not just the military situation but the entire trajectory of the war. Germany's defeat, always probable after Stalingrad, was now certain. The only question was how long it would take and how many more would die. Operation Bagration remains one of military history's most complete victories. In 5 weeks, the Soviet Union destroyed an entire German army group, liberated Belarus and opened the path to Berlin. The numbers, 300,000 casualties, 28 divisions destroyed, only hint at the human catastrophe. Each statistic represents someone's son, husband, father. German families would wait years for news of missing soldiers, most of whom had died in unmarked graves in Belarus forests. Yet Bagration is barely known in Western historical consciousness, overshadowed by D-Day, which began 2 weeks earlier. While Allied forces struggled in Normandy hedgerows, the Red Army was conducting deep battle operations on a scale the Western Allies never matched. The destruction of Army Group Center did more to ensure Nazi Germany's defeat than any other single operation of 1944. For military professionals, Bagration demonstrated the evolution of Soviet operational art. Deep battle, Maskirovka, combined arms coordination. Concepts that would influence military thinking through the Cold War and beyond. The Wehrmacht, which had pioneered mobile warfare, was destroyed by an enemy that had learned its lessons and surpassed its teachers. But perhaps the deepest lesson is about hubris. The German army that invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 believed in its racial and technical superiority. That army died in the forests of Belarus, destroyed by the very people it had dismissed as inferior. History offers few examples of nemesis so complete. The fortresses Hitler insisted would never fall became graveyards. The soldiers told they were supermen died as frightened boys far from home. Colonel Hans-Georg Leyser survived the war, dying in 1969. In his memoirs he wrote, "Bagration was not just a military defeat. It was the moment we understood the war was truly lost. Not possibly lost, not probably lost, but absolutely, irreversibly lost. After that, we were just counting days until the end." That end would come less than a year later, in the ruins of Berlin, where the army that had once terrorized Europe made its last stand against the forces it had unleashed. The catastrophe that began on June 22, 1944, ended on May 8, 1945. In between lay the death throes of the Third Reich, written in blood across the map of Europe.